The sun poured over the Whitmore estate like liquid gold, warming the sprawling lawns and making the crystal blue water of the pool glisten like something out of a magazine cover. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses floated through the air. The guests, 40 or so of the city's most influential, wore linen suits and summer dresses, every detail of their appearance screaming wealth and influence. It was the kind of scene that could be printed in a lifestyle magazine, perfect, controlled, curated. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of it all, tall and commanding in his tailored navy suit, even on a summer afternoon. His dark sunglasses hid eyes that measured everything around him like a man always calculating profit and loss. He was a figure people respected publicly, but spoke of quietly behind closed doors. A real estate tycoon whose handshake could seal a deal or end a career. He smiled when required, but it never reached his eyes. Near the pool, in a specially designed adaptive chair that floated gently on the surface, sat his daughter, Isabella. At 15, she had the delicate grace of someone who had learned to navigate a world not built for her. Cerebral palsy made every movement deliberate, each gesture carrying weight. Yet her mind was sharp, her smile warm when she trusted you. Today, she had been laughing with Rosa, her swim assistant, as the chair rocked in the sunlight. For Isabella, swimming was one of the few activities where she felt free, weightless, unbound by the limitations of her body. On the far side of the lawn, half in the shadow of the maintenance shed, Thiago Santos moved quietly. At 17, he was already taller than his father, Miguel, the Whitmore estate's janitor. The Santos family had worked here for years, though to Richard they were invisible, part of the background machinery that kept his empire polished. Thiago had grown, up within these walls, knowing every hidden corridor, every quirk of the sprawling property. He wasn't loud or eager to be noticed. He observed, he listened. And today, as he carried a tray of bottled water past the pool, his eyes caught something others missed. The sound was faint, almost lost under the music, a small metallic click followed by a hiss of air. Thiago's gaze shifted to Isabella's floating chair. The safety harness that held her steady looked loose, its straps slackening in slow, dangerous inches. Her laughter quieted into a puzzled frown as the chair began to tilt unnaturally to one side. No one noticed. The guests were busy adjusting sunglasses, sipping champagne, debating investment returns. Even Rosa had her back turned, helping another guest near the pool steps. Thiago's heartbeat spiked. His mind calculated faster than his feet could move. Isabella's legs couldn't kick to keep her above water. The chair was heavy, custom-built. The slope of the pool's floor meant that once she tipped, she'd sink quickly. He saw her mouth open, not in laughter now, but in a gasp. One of her hands gripped the chair's side, the other flailed helplessly. The tilt became a drop. Her face dipped beneath the surface, and for a moment the sunlight shattered across ripples like broken glass. Someone had to move. Someone had to see. Thiago's tray hit the ground, water bottles scattering across the marble tiles. His body lunged forward before his mind even finished the thought. Guests turned their heads at the sudden noise, brows furrowed more in annoyance than alarm. And then came the sound that cut through all the idle chatter, the deep, clean splash of Thiago diving headfirst into the pool. The party froze. Conversations died mid-sentence. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Through the cool rush of water around his ears, Thiago could hear nothing. Just the pounding of his own heart as he kicked hard toward the sinking shadow of Isabella's chair. Above, champagne flutes trembled in stunned hands. No one else moved. And that was when the realization would come later, to everyone watching. The life of the meal. Millionaire's daughter was not saved by wealth or status or influence, but by the son of the man who cleaned their floors. Thiago's body sliced through the water like a blade, bubbles erupting around him as the pool's bright surface turned into a distorted shimmer above his head. The cold hit him, shocking his skin, but there was no time to adjust. His eyes were locked on the shadow sinking just ahead. Isabella's limp form, tangled in the chair's straps, drifted deeper, her pale dress billowing like a ghost in the blue. His lungs burned almost instantly, but his focus was absolute. He reached her in seconds, fingers finding the stubborn clasp of the harness. The buckle had jammed, twisted from the way she'd slipped. He yanked once. Nothing. Come on, his mind screamed. Her eyes were half shut now, bubbles slipping past her lips. Thiago's heart pounded harder, not from lack of air but from the cold spike of fear that he might be too late. He gritted his teeth and twisted the buckle again, his hands steady despite the urgency. At last it snapped free. He slid one arm under her back, the other under her legs, and kicked hard toward the light above. The moment they broke the surface, the sound of the world crashed back. Gasps, shouts, the clatter of chairs scraping on marble. Water streamed from his face as he held her high, supporting her head. "Call an ambulance," someone yelled, but no one moved with the speed that mattered. Thiago swam to the edge, every muscle straining under the weight of her and the soaked chair straps still tangled around them both. A pair of manicured hands reached out hesitantly, as if afraid to touch the water. "Help me lift her," he barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. That urgency, raw, commanding, made two men finally kneel and grab Isabella's arms, pulling her gently onto the warm marble. She coughed, a weak sputter that made Thiago's chest unclench just slightly. Water streamed from her mouth, and her hand clung to his wrist with surprising strength. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. Her eyes, wide with fear moments ago, now glimmered with something else. Relief. But before Thiago could answer, the crowd parted like water before a wave, and Richard Whitmore strode in. His face was flushed, his tailored shirt open at the collar, and the way people stepped back told Thiago everything about the man's power in this room. "What the hell is going on?" Richard's voice was sharp enough to cut. He looked first at his coughing daughter, then at Thiago, soaked, panting, crouched at her side. "Dad, Isabella began, but Richard raised a hand, silencing her instantly. His gaze locked on Thiago, hard and cold. "What are you doing in the social area?" he demanded. "Didn't your father teach you to stay in your place?" Thiago didn't flinch. His chest was still heaving, water dripping from his hair onto the marble, but his eyes stayed fixed on Richard's. In those eyes was no apology, no shame, only a calm defiance that Richard wasn't used to seeing from anyone, let alone the janitor's son. Around them, the guests shifted uncomfortably. No one dared correct Richard, no one pointed out the truth, that Thiago had just saved his daughter's life while they all stood frozen. And in that moment, Thiago knew this wasn't going to end with gratitude. This was the beginning of something else entirely, something much bigger than either of them realized. The sunlight still danced across the pool, but the air had gone cold. Conversations, once loud and carefree, had thinned to a nervous murmur. Richard Whitmore stood over Thiago like a judge delivering a sentence, his shadow stretching long over the wet marble. Isabella's hand still clutched Thiago's arm, her grip weak but urgent. "Dad, he saved me." "I said quiet, Isabella." Richard's voice was low but sharp, each syllable precise enough to cut. He didn't even glance at her as he spoke. His gaze stayed locked on Thiago, like the boy's very existence was an offense. Thiago straightened slowly, water dripping from his shirt, pooling around his sneakers. His pulse was steady now, but a different kind of weight pressed on his chest, a weight he recognized all too well. It was the same look he'd seen on men who thought they could buy the right to humiliate someone. "You had no business in this part of the property," Richard said, stepping closer until they were barely 2 feet apart. "You think just because your father works here you can wander wherever you please?" "I didn't wander," Thiago replied, his voice calm, almost quiet. "I saw your daughter was drowning." A few guests shifted on their feet, their eyes darting between the two. Someone cleared their throat as if to speak, but Richard's sharp glance froze them in place. "You're lucky I'm not calling the police," Richard continued, his tone dripping with contempt. "People like you don't understand boundaries. You see an opportunity and think it's your ticket in." Thiago's jaw tightened. He wanted to say that boundaries didn't matter when someone's life was slipping under the water. He wanted to ask why none of Richard's important guests had moved, but he didn't. He just met the man's gaze and held it, his silence speaking louder than anything he could have said. Richard turned to one of the securities, guards lingering near the patio steps. "Make sure he leaves immediately. And call Miguel. Tell him to come collect his son before he does any more damage." "Dad!" Isabella's voice cracked as she tried again to speak, this time with desperation. You can't. I can. And I just did, Richard snapped, finally looking at her. You shouldn't have been using that defective equipment in the first place, and I will not have the staff's children disrupting events meant for our guests. Thiago glanced at Isabella. Her eyes shone, not with the lingering terror of the pool, but with frustration that her voice didn't matter in her own home. A security guard approached, his expression apologetic but his step steady. Thiago didn't resist. He gave Isabella one last look, a silent message that he understood. Then he let the guard guide him away from the pool, water still dripping from his clothes, each step leaving a trail on the flawless marble. Behind him, the party's noise tried to rise again, but it never quite reached its earlier warmth. The guests avoided looking directly at Richard, but no one challenged him. Not here, not in his domain. And as Thiago walked away, he felt the first spark of something dangerous and unshakable. This wasn't over. By nightfall, the Whitmore mansion's glitter had faded into silence, the kind of silence that presses down heavy and cold. But in the small staff housing at the far edge of the property, the air was thick with tension. Carmen Santos, Thiago's mother, stood frozen in the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. Her eyes darted toward her son, who was drying his hair with an old towel, still in the same damp clothes from earlier. On the other end of the line, Richard Whitmore's voice was like ice. Carmen, you and your son have 24 hours to vacate the premises. Consider this an act of generosity, given the breach of security protocol that took place today. Mr. Whitmore, she began, her voice trembling. Do not interrupt me. His tone hardened. Your son entered the social area uninvited. This is unacceptable. I'm also warning you, keep him off my property from now on. If he sets foot here again, I will have him arrested for trespassing. Carmen's lips parted, a dozen protests burning in her throat, but the line went dead before she could speak them. Thiago watched her lower the phone slowly, as though it had turned to stone in her hand. What did he say? He asked, though he already knew. She tried to smile, but it cracked halfway. Pack your things, Philo. We have to be out by tomorrow night. There was no panic in Thiago's expression. Instead, a stillness settled over him, the kind that comes before a storm. Because I saved his daughter? Because, Carmen said, lowering herself into a chair, men like Richard Whitmore will always find a reason to crush someone who doesn't bow to them. Her hands shook as she reached for a glass of water. Miguel would be furious if he were here to see this. Thiago sat across from her, elbows on the table. We'll be fine, Mai. You've always said we're more than the walls we live in. Her eyes filled, but she blinked. Hard to keep the tears from falling. Thiago, this man has money, lawyers, influence. He can destroy lives without a second thought. Thiago's gaze didn't waver. And people like him think they're untouchable until someone proves otherwise. Outside, the estate was dark except for the glow of the main house. Somewhere in those bright rooms, Richard was likely celebrating his victory, satisfied that the problem had been dealt with. He didn't know that the boy he'd dismissed was already turning the pieces of the day over in his mind, searching for connections, patterns, opportunities. Later that night, as Carmen tried to sleep in their narrow bed, Thiago sat at the small kitchen table with his old laptop open. The hum of the fan filled the quiet as his fingers moved over the keys. He wasn't scrolling aimlessly, he was digging, already searching for threads to pull. When he paused, his reflection stared back from the darkened screen. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight far heavier than his years. He thinks he knows me, Thiago murmured, but he has no idea. The next morning, cardboard boxes sat half-filled on the floor of the small staff quarters. Carmen moved slowly, folding clothes with mechanical precision, her eyes distant. The hum of the ceiling fan did nothing to cut the heavy air. Thiago sat at the kitchen table, his battered laptop open, its screen casting a pale glow over his face. He had been there since dawn, earbuds in, scanning page after page of public records. His mother had woken to find him already deep in work, a half-eaten slice of toast at his elbow. Thiago, she said softly, setting a stack of folded towels into a box. Please tell me you're looking at college applications and not whatever this is. I'm looking at public information, he replied without glancing up. Stuff anyone can access. Her hands stilled. And why would you be looking at anything connected to that man? Because, he said, leaning back in his chair, men like Richard Whitmore leave fingerprints on everything they touch. All you have to do is look closely enough. He turned the screen toward her. On it was a spreadsheet he had pieced together from corporate registries, property deeds, and government contract databases. Company names filled the list, many unfamiliar, but the same signature appeared in the fine print. Richard D. Whitmore. These shell companies, Thiago tapped the trackpad. They're all tied to him. Some of them don't even have real offices, just mail drops. And these contracts, he highlighted a section, were awarded with no competitive bidding. That's not normal. Carmen sank into the chair opposite him, the weight of their situation pressing heavier on her shoulders. Thiago, I know you're smart, smarter than most people I've met, but this is dangerous. He smiled faintly, not in arrogance, but in quiet certainty. Do you remember the story you always told me about Grandpa, how he built our fine, first house brick by brick even when everyone said a black man would never own property in that neighborhood? Yes, she said slowly, not sure where he was going. He didn't build that house just to prove he could, Thiago said. He built it to prove they were wrong. Carmen studied his face. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was focused. That calm, steady focus she had seen before, when he took apart broken electronics to fix them, when he spent nights teaching himself code from library books. It was the look of someone who had already decided on a course of action. From the corner of the table, his phone buzzed. A text from an unfamiliar number flashed briefly before the screen went dark. Thiago glanced at it, then back at his laptop, his mind already connecting the dots. Outside, the Whitmore mansion loomed in the distance, its white walls catching the morning sun. It looked untouchable, the kind of place that could crush anything in its shadow. But Thiago knew better. He knew every fortress had a flaw, and he had just found his first crack. The following Monday, the school halls buzzed with their usual chatter, lockers slamming and sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floors. Thiago moved through the noise like a shadow, his mind far from the teenage gossip swirling around him. He carried a battered backpack slung over one shoulder, the same one he'd had for years, worn at the seams from overstuffed library books and secondhand notebooks. By third period, he was seated in the back row of Professor Janet Morrison's computer science class, his laptop open, but not on the assignment she had given. Instead, columns of data scrolled down his screen, company registries, financial reports, addresses he'd cross-checked with satellite images. He had learned long ago how to look busy while working on something else entirely. Janet Morrison was not an easy teacher to fool. A woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes behind rectangular glasses, she carried herself like someone who'd seen too much of the world to be impressed easily. Before teaching, she'd been an investigative journalist, the kind who dug into stories that made powerful people sweat. Halfway through the lesson, her gaze flicked toward the back of the room. She watched Thiago for a moment, the way his eyes narrowed slightly at the screen, his fingers moving with purpose. When the bell rang, students filed out, but Janet's voice stopped him before he reached the door. Thiago, a word. He paused, then turned slowly, trying to read her tone. It wasn't stern. It was curious. You weren't following today's lesson, she said plainly, walking toward her desk. But you weren't distracted either. That's different. Thiago stayed quiet. She tilted her head. You're investigating someone, aren't you? His jaw tightened, but something about her expression made him answer honestly. Yes, ma'am. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. Who? The man who fired at my mother. Richard Whitmore, she said without hesitation, as if she had already guessed. Thiago's eyes flicked to hers. You know him? Only by reputation, she said, and it's not a good one. He hesitated, then slid his laptop toward her. This is what I have so far. Janet adjusted her glasses and began scrolling through the files. Her lips pressed together as she read, a flicker of something. Was it admiration passing through her eyes? You've compiled more in a week than some journalists manage in months. She set the laptop down. But you're walking into dangerous territory. Men like Whitmore don't fight fair. You need to be careful about what you can and can't prove. Thiago nodded. That's why I'm showing you. I don't want to make a mistake. She studied him for a long moment. I'll help you, but you follow my lead. First rule, everything we do legally. We build the case so tight that when it drops, it crushes him under its own weight. Thiago felt a small spark in his chest. Not excitement exactly, but something close. Relief, maybe. For the first time since that afternoon at the pool, he wasn't fighting alone. As he packed his laptop, Janet added, You remind me of someone I used to be before I learned just how ugly people like Whitmore can get. But I'll warn you, once you start down this road, you don't stop until it's finished. Thiago met her gaze. Good. I'm not planning to stop. The Whitmore mansion was quieter than usual, its long halls stripped of the chatter and footsteps Isabella once took for granted. Since the incident at the pool, her father had tightened the boundaries of her world into something suffocating. Her phone was gone, her swimming lessons canceled. Even Rosa, her trusted swim assistant, had been replaced by a private nurse whose primary job seemed to be watching. The new nurse, Evelyn, wasn't cruel, just distant. She moved like a shadow in the background, attending to Isabella's needs without conversation. But Rosa had been different. She talked to Isabella like a friend, laughed with her, and never made her feel like a fragile piece of glass. Tonight, though, something shifted. Rosa appeared at Isabella's door, her eyes darting nervously down the hall before stepping inside. She held her own phone in her hand, the screen dimmed. 5 minutes, Rosa whispered. That's all I can give you before someone notices. Isabella's pulse quickened. Thiago? She asked immediately. Rosa nodded and pressed the phone into her palm. Call him, now. Isabella didn't hesitate. She tapped the screen, and when Thiago's voice came through, it was like oxygen filling her lungs for the first time in days. Isa, are you okay? I'm fine, she whispered, glancing toward the closed door. Listen, I don't have much time. I have to tell you something. She could almost hear him lean forward on the other end. What is it? My father has a secret office, she said quickly. It's in the basement, behind my grandfather's portrait. I've heard him talking in there, late at night, with people I don't recognize. I think he keeps important things in a safe behind that picture. Thiago's mind immediately began connecting the pieces. What kind of things? I don't know, she said. But whatever they are, they're important enough for him to pick himself in there almost every night. And, Thiago? Her voice softened. Be careful. He's angrier than I've ever seen him. I think he's planning something. Thiago's reply was calm, measured, but she could hear the determination beneath it. Thank you, Isa. This helps more than you know. Before she could say anything else, Rosa tapped her shoulder. Time's up. Isabella's throat tightened as she handed back the phone. Promise me you won't stop. I promise, he said, just before the line went dead. Rosa slipped the phone into her pocket and gave Isabella a look that was part warning, part solidarity. I didn't hear anything, she said quietly, then left as quickly as she'd come. Isabella leaned back in her chair, heart still racing. Somewhere out there, Thiago was piecing together a puzzle no one else even knew existed, and now she had given him one of the corner pieces. In the small rented apartment across town, Thiago sat back from his desk, a faint, almost dangerous smile forming. The picture in his mind was getting clearer, and Richard Whitmore had just made his first real mistake. Thiago sat hunched over his laptop, the glow from the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. Isabella's words played in his head on a loop. Behind my grandfather's portrait. A safe. It wasn't just information. It was an opening. He pulled up the blueprint archives for the Whitmore estate, something he'd found weeks ago buried in the county's planning records. There it was, the basement layout. On paper, it was labeled as storage and utility space, but one section was marked with a blank wall that didn't quite line up with the dimensions of the house. He knew immediately that had to be it. Now came the harder part. Richard Whitmore's private office wasn't just hidden. It was under heavy surveillance. Cameras, alarms, keycard locks. Thiago had seen enough of them in his years around the estate to know it was designed for secrecy. Breaking in physically was impossible without setting off an army of security guards. But there was another way. Thiago leaned closer to the screen, fingers flying over the keyboard. He remembered something from the months he'd helped his father clean the main house. Richard had a habit of accessing the mansion's security system from his phone during meetings, always boasting that it gave him control anywhere in the world. That remote access, if configured carelessly, could be a weak point. He dug into old manuals for the same brand of security system, reading line by line until he found what he was looking for. A firmware vulnerability that hadn't been patched in years. It was small, but with the right code, it could give him backdoor access to the video feeds. The clock on the microwave read 1:47 a.m. as Thiago ran his first test. For a moment, the screen flickered, and then a live feed appeared. The Whitmore Mansion's main hallway. The image was crisp, almost surreal. He switched to another camera, the library, another, the pool, his pulse quickened. Then he found it. A camera positioned in a narrow, dimly lit room with a mahogany desk and hanging above it, a large portrait of an older man in military uniform. He watched as Richard himself entered the frame, phone pressed to his ear. His voice came through faintly from the security feed's audio pickup. No, they're not a problem anymore. The Santos boy? He won't try anything. He knows better. A pause. Still, we'll discuss it tonight. I want this resolved before the quarter ends. Richard hung up, turned to the portrait, and pressed a hidden latch. The painting swung forward, revealing a heavy steel safe. He spun the dial, opened it, and pulled out a stack of files, flipping through them with a frown. Thiago's breath caught, not because of the safe itself, but because he now had proof. Richard wasn't just hiding something, he was guarding it like his life depended on it. He hit the record button, saving every second of the footage to an encrypted drive. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place faster than he'd expected. Somewhere in the mansion, Richard believed he was untouchable. In the dim light of a cramped apartment across town, Thiago knew better. He'd just found the crack in the armor, and he was ready to drive a wedge straight through it. The morning after capturing the basement footage, Thiago walked into school with the same worn backpack. But inside, it wasn't just textbooks. His laptop and an encrypted flash drive held hours of evidence that could rip through Richard Whitmore's reputation like a storm. He didn't head straight to class. Instead, he made his way to Professor Janet Morrison's office, closing the door behind him. She glanced up from her desk, taking one look at his face before setting her pen down. "You found something," she said. Thiago plugged the flash drive into her computer and opened the file without a word. The feed played in silence at first, Richard stepping into his hidden office, pulling files from the safe. Then came his voice. "The Santos boy? He won't try anything, he knows better." Janet's brow tightened. She leaned forward, watching the rest of the footage with unblinking focus. When it ended, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "This is big," she said finally. "Bigger than I expected." Thiago kept his tone steady. "I can't take this to the police, not yet. If it slips through the cracks, he'll bury us." She nodded. "You need a lawyer, someone who knows how to navigate men like Whitmore." She picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts. "I'm calling Marcus Chun, civil rights attorney, specializes in cases against people who think their money makes them invincible. If he takes this, it becomes more than just evidence. It becomes a case." Later that afternoon, Thiago sat across from Marcus in a cramped, paper-stacked office that smelled faintly of coffee and old leather. Marcus was in his 40s, sharp-eyed, wearing a suit that looked more functional than fashionable. He listened without interrupting as Thiago walked him through the footage, the company records, the pattern of shell corporations. When the presentation was done, Marcus steepled his fins. "Gers, you're 17 and you've built a better case in 2 weeks than some investigators manage in 6 months. Thiago met his gaze evenly. "It's not enough to bring him down. Not yet." "You're right," Marcus said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "But it's enough to start building something airtight. And if we do this right, Whitmore won't see it coming until it's too late." Carmen, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke. "I don't want my son getting hurt." Marcus looked at her seriously. "Mrs. Santos, if we do this right, the only one who'll be hurt is the man who's been hurting others for years." Thiago closed his laptop, a quiet resolve settling over him. With Marcus on board, this wasn't just a personal mission anymore. It was a campaign. And for the first time, he could feel the weight shifting ever so slightly in his favor. Richard Whitmore had money, influence, and the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Thiago had truth, strategy, and now, allies. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of quiet intensity. By daylight, Thiago went to school, keeping his head down in his routine ordinary. By night, the apartment kitchen became a war room. Laptops, his old repaired one and two more Marcus had loaned him, glowed across the table. Piles of printed records sat in neat stacks, each labeled in his careful handwriting. Contracts, shell companies, lawsuits, witnesses. Marcus came by almost every evening after work, suit jacket off, tie loosened, a steaming coffee in hand. He brought structure to Thiago's findings, teaching him how to organize evidence into a narrative that could withstand the kind of legal counterattack Richard would surely launch. "This isn't just about catching him doing something wrong," Marcus said one night, leaning over Thiago's shoulder as they reviewed a spreadsheet. "It's about building a chain of proof so strong that when we drop it, the whole thing crushes him. No gaps, no room for doubt." Thiago nodded, scrolling through the security footage again, this time slowed frame by frame. Every detail mattered. The way Richard opened the safe, the documents inside, even the brand of lock. Everything could be a lead. Carmen moved quietly in the background, making tea, keeping the space warm even as her worry grew. Sometimes she paused at the doorway, watching her son work with a seriousness far beyond his years. In between data pulls and document scans, Marcus coached Thiago on witness outreach. They made a list of former employees, maids, contractors, maintenance staff, who had left the Whitmore estate under suspicious circumstances. Thiago's phone became a lifeline, buzzing at odd hours with cautious text messages from people who had stories to tell but had been too afraid to speak. One, a former accountant for Whitmore Holdings, sent over a trove of internal memos hinting at fraudulent bill. Another, a landscaper, described late-night deliveries to the mansion's basement and whispered about guests who never used the front door. Thiago filed every scrap of it, cross-referencing dates, matching names, looking for overlaps. The work was exhausting, but it gave him something Richard could never take away: control. By the third week, the binders Marcus kept were thick with evidence. Still, Thiago kept pushing. "It's not enough yet," he said one night, eyes red from staring at the screen. Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You're right. We go until there's no stone left unturned." And so they did. Thiago dug through obscure court filings, municipal archives, even trade magazines that mentioned Whitmore's projects. He found patterns everywhere: projects over budget, subcontractors that existed on paper but not in reality, political donations timed perfectly with contract approvals. One night, as rain pattered against the kitchen window, Marcus closed a file and leaned back. "You realize," he said slowly, "you're not just building a case. You're building the blueprint for dismantling an empire." Thiago's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Good. Because somewhere across town, in the glowing halls of his mansion, Richard Whitmore still believed the boy he'd thrown out would fade into nothing. And Thiago intended to make that his biggest mistake. In the Whitmore mansion, the atmosphere had shifted back to the comfortable arrogance Richard thrived in. The whispers from the pool incident had faded in his circles, replaced by new gossip and new deals. In his mind, the Santos family was gone, a closed chapter. One evening, Richard stood in his library, swirling a glass of scotch while a few close associates lounged in leather chairs. The conversation was casual, but every word carried the self-satisfied tone of a man convinced of his own invincibility. "That janitor's boy," Richard scoffed, chuckling at his own story. "Tried to play the hero. I made sure his family was gone before he got any ideas about sticking around. People like that, predictable. They try to bite the hand that feeds them, then fade into nothing when you push back." His friends laughed politely, some with genuine amusement, others because no one in Richard's orbit dared do otherwise. He leaned back, savoring the moment. Across town, in the cramped apartment kitchen, Thiago listened to those very words through a pair of cheap earbuds. The feed came directly from the security cameras Richard still hadn't realized were compromised. Every laugh, every dismissive remark was captured and time-stamped. Predictable, huh? Thiago murmured under his breath, a glint in his eyes. Richard's overconfidence wasn't limited to idle talk. Over the next week, he began cutting corners in ways he normally wouldn't have risked. He approved a shady construction deal without covering the paper trail, spoke openly about payoffs during phone calls, and even berated a city inspector in his office, an exchange Thiago captured in high definition. Meanwhile, Marcus was steadily stacking these moments into the growing case file. "He's slipping," Marcus said one night, flipping through printed transcripts. "He thinks the only danger comes from people who can fight him on his level. He doesn't realize you're already there." Thiago barely looked up from his laptop. The more he talks, the easier this gets. But it wasn't just the words, it was the pattern. Richard's arrogance made him sloppy, and every careless move fed directly into the quiet storm Thiago was building. The boy who had been ordered off the property was now in the mansion more than ever, not in person, but in every camera feed, every intercepted call, every document that passed through the vulnerable network. And Richard, blind to the truth, kept boasting about how untouchable he was. That night, as the feed showed Richard raising another glass in the library, Thiago leaned back in his chair. "Keep talking," he said softly. "You're writing the ending yourself." The plan had been taking shape for weeks, but Thiago knew that timing was everything. Dropping evidence too soon would give Richard room to maneuver, to bury it under lawyers and PR teams. Dropping it too late would risk someone else catching wind and taking control of the narrative. It had to be now, when Richard was at his most arrogant, his most careless, when he believed with absolute certainty that the boy he'd thrown out was forgotten. Thiago sat at the kitchen table in the dim light of early morning, 3 laptops open in front of him. Marcus stood by the counter, coffee in hand, while Janet leaned against the wall, her eyes locked on the growing storm of files and scheduled transmissions. "This is the drop," Marcus said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Thiago nodded, his fingers steady on the keyboard. Every news outlet gets it at the same time. The FBI, the IRS, the Attorney General's office. It's all going out in one hit. He clicked a final key, and the files began to copy to a secure cloud server that would automatically release them to hundreds of recipients at 8:00 a.m. sharp. The evidence was overwhelming. Video and audio recordings of Richard discussing fraudulent contracts, payments to city officials, threats against witnesses. There were bank records from shell companies, internal memos from frightened employees, photographs of cash deliveries. The crown jewel, the basement footage of Richard opening the hidden safe, removing sensitive documents, and speaking openly about eliminating problems, with Thiago's name in the same sentence. By 8:05, the first notification lit up Marcus's phone. The Herald Tribune was already running a breaking news banner. By 8:12, national networks were calling it one of the largest white-collar corruption leaks in the state's history. Inside Whitmore Holdings' gleaming downtown headquarters, Richard was halfway through his morning coffee when his phone exploded with alerts, texts from his secretary, missed calls from board members, emails with subject lines that made his stomach knot. He tapped one from his lawyer, Harrison Wells. "We need to meet, right now." By the time Richard reached his office, camera crews were gathering on the sidewalk below. Wells was already waiting, a laptop open to dozens of headlines. Richard's eyes darted from one to the next. Real estate mogul linked to massive fraud scheme. Leaked audio ties Whitmore to witness threats, exclusive inside the secret safe of Richard Whitmore. "This is impossible," Richard said, his voice shaking. "These files, how could anyone get this? My office is locked down, my phone—" "Don't say anything else," Wells interrupted sharply. "The FBI is on their way. They have warrants." Richard froze, his mind scrambling for an enemy capable of this. Then his phone buzzed with a single email notification. No subject line. The sender, santos@encryptedmail.com. He clicked it, and the words hit like a punch to the chest. "Mr. Whitmore, you once told me people like me were predictable. I predicted exactly how you'd react to being exposed. The difference is simple. You use your power to destroy lives. I use my intelligence to protect them. The authorities have everything. Consider this checkmate." There was no signature, just 3 letters at the bottom. T.S. Richard's hand tightened on the phone as the sound of sirens grew louder outside. Across town in the small apartment kitchen, Thiago sat back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile on his face as the morning news anchors began dismantling the empire of a man who'd thought himself untouchable. By the time the first black SUVs rolled up to the Whitmore mansion, the news had already beaten them there. Reporters and camera crews swarmed the gated entrance, their lenses aimed at the sprawling estate that had once been the symbol of Richard Whitmore's untouchable status. Inside, the rhythmic knock of fists on the front door was quickly replaced by the firm voice of Special Agent Victoria Torres. Federal Bureau of Investigation, we have a warrant to search the premises. The door opened to a wall of Navy windbreakers and armed agents. Richard appeared in the grand foyer, his expression somewhere between disbelief and fury. This is a private residence, he barked. Torres didn't flinch. And this is a lawful search. Step aside, Mr. Whitmore. Within minutes, agents fanned out through the house, 2 heading straight for the basement, another team sweeping the upstairs offices. Technicians in gloves photographed every document, every computer, every flash drive they found. In the kitchen, a pair of agents were already sealing evidence bags with bundles of cash pulled from a cabinet that wasn't even locked. He's gotten sloppy, one of them muttered. Richard followed Agent Torres down the marble staircase to the basement, his voice low but venomous. Do you have any idea who I am? Yes, she replied, her tone almost bored. You're the man whose entire criminal operation we have on tape, including this. She stopped before the portrait of Richard's grandfather. Care to open it for us, or should we do it? Richard's jaw tightened. I'm not touching anything. Torres turned to her team. Open it. The portrait swung forward, revealing the heavy steel safe. An agent knelt, spinning the dial. Less than a minute later, it clicked open. Inside, the evidence was almost theatrical. Ledgers, signed contracts, unmarked envelopes of cash, and a small hard drive with a label that simply read, personal. Richard's shoulders sagged for just a moment, a flicker of the man realizing this was no longer containable. But then the mask of defiance returned. None of that will hold up, he said flatly. Torres didn't even look at him. We'll let the courts decide. Across town, in the modest kitchen of their new apartment, Carmen stood frozen in front of the television. The live news feed showed the FBI hauling boxes and computers out of the Whitmore estate, reporters shouting questions over the hum of generators and camera shutters. Thiago leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his face calm. It's starting, he said quietly. Carmen turned to him, her eyes wide. You did this. We did this, he corrected. Me, you, Marcus, Janet, even Issa. On the screen, Richard was being escorted out of his own home, his wrists cuffed in front of him. For a man who had always looked perfectly in control, the sight was jarring, his hair slightly out of place, his eyes darting toward the cameras as if searching for a way to rewrite the moment. But the footage didn't lie, and neither did the trail Thiago had spent months building. Richard was loaded into the back of a black SUV, the door slamming shut behind him. In that instant, the gates of the Whitmore mansion, once a symbol of power, closed not to keep others out, but to seal him in his own downfall. Thiago didn't smile, not yet. The case was just beginning, and the real justice was still to come. By the next morning, the Whitmore name was plastered across every headline in the country. Real estate mogul arrested in massive corruption scandal, exclusive, secret recordings reveal threats, fraud, and hidden safe. FBI raid uncovers millions in cash at Whitmore estate. Richard's face, captured mid-step in his orange jumpsuit during booking, was replayed on every news channel. The man who had once demanded the spotlight now found himself bathed in it for all the wrong reasons. At the Santos apartment, the TV flickered between news anchors and on-the-ground reporters outside the federal courthouse. Carmen sat at the small table with a mug of tea she'd barely touched. Thiago was at the counter, his laptop open, the screen split between legal documents Marcus had sent and a live feed of the courthouse steps. This is bigger than I thought, Carmen murmured, watching footage of agents wheeling out evidence carts stacked with boxes. Thiago's voice was steady. That's because he made it big. All I did was show people what was already there. The phone rang, startling them both. Carmen answered, then held the receiver out to her son. "It's Janet." Thiago took it. "Professor?" "Turn to channel 7, she said, her voice tight with urgency. He switched the channel. A live shot from outside the Whitmore estate filled the screen. A black SUV pulled up to the gates, and from the back seat emerged Isabella, flanked by 2 social workers. She wore a pale sweater and clutched a small bag to her chest. "She's been removed from her father's custody," Janet said over the phone. "Temporary guardianship while they assess the situation." On screen, Isabella paused at the gates, looking back at the towering mansion. The camera zoomed in enough to catch her expression. Sadness, yes, but also a strange relief. Thiago didn't realize he'd stepped closer to the TV until Carmen's hand landed on his shoulder. A reporter called out a question, and Isabella surprised everyone by answering. "I'm safe," she said simply, "and I want to keep studying with my friend." Thiago's chest tightened. He didn't need her to say his name. The world didn't either. By afternoon, Marcus was in their living room, papers spread across the coffee table. With Whitmore in custody, this becomes about building the airtight case for trial. But there's something else. Isabella's foster family has formally requested you as her educational guardian. She asked for it specifically. Carmen looked at Thiago, her eyes softening. "You saved her life twice now, once in the pool, and now." Thiago sat back, letting the weight of it settle. This had started as a way to protect his mother and himself, but it had grown into something bigger, something that had pulled Isabella out of a gilded prison and into a chance at real freedom. Outside, the city moved on with its noise and its chaos. Inside, Thiago realized for the first time that this wasn't just a fight he'd won, it was a life he'd changed. And the trial hadn't even started yet. 3 years later, the spring air in Cambridge carried the kind of warmth that hinted summer was near. Harvard Yard was alive with families, camera shutters clicking, and the hum of voices in dozens of languages. On the steps of Sanders Theater, graduates in crimson robes and tasseled caps clustered for photos, their faces split with the kind of joy that comes from knowing they've climbed a mountain. Thiago stood among them, the sash across his shoulders marking his dual degree in computer science and digital law, a program the university had created for him after his case had made national headlines. The once worn second-hand backpack was gone, replaced by a sleek leather satchel, but the calm focus in his eyes was the same. Carmen sat in the front row of the assembled crowd, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes never leaving her son. She wore a simple navy dress and the proud, radiant smile of a woman who had lived every step of this journey with him. When it was his turn to speak, Thiago walked to the podium, adjusting the microphone as the crowd quieted. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't need them. 3 years ago, he began, his voice steady, I was told I didn't know my place. At the time, that was meant to put me in a box, defined by the neighborhood I came from, the color of my skin, and my mother's job. What my accuser didn't realize was that he was right. I didn't know my place, because it wasn't on any map he understood. The crowd leaned in, the wind catching the edge of his gown. My place, he continued, was never determined by where I started. It was built by turning injustice into fuel, by refusing to accept that someone else's low opinion could be my ceiling. I learned that true revenge isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's building something so extraordinary that they regret not having you on their side. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Carmen's eyes shimmered, her lips pressed together to keep from crying. I stand here today, Thiago said, not as the janitor's son who should have disappeared, but as proof that greatness doesn't ask for permission. It's earned, brick by brick, choice by choice. And when we use it not just for ourselves, but to open doors for others, it becomes something far greater than success. It becomes legacy. When he stepped back from the podium, the audience rose to their feet. The standing ovation rolled over him like a wave. 5 full minutes of applause, whistles, and cheers. He found his mother in the crowd and smiled, a quiet, private smile meant only for her. Somewhere in a federal prison miles away, Richard Whitmore would no doubt hear about this day. Maybe he'd read about it in the papers. Maybe someone would show him the broadcast. And maybe, just maybe, he'd understand that the boy he'd tried to crush had built something untouchable. A gray rain fell over the federal penitentiary in Danbury, streaking the narrow window of Richard Whitmore's cell. Inside, he sat at the small metal desk, pen moving slowly over a sheet of lined paper. The man who once signed multi-million-dollar contracts with a flourish now wrote in a cramped, uneven hand. The letter was never meant to be sent, he knew that. But something about putting the words down gave him a strange kind of release. I completely underestimated that boy, he wrote. I thought money and power could crush anyone who dared to challenge me. I never imagined he'd have the patience to build my destruction piece by piece, using my arrogance as the mortar. He stopped for a moment, staring at the line before underlining arrogance. It was the same weapon he had used on others, the same flaw he had never been able to see in himself. On the final page he wrote, "The irony is perfect. I spent my life looking down on people I thought were beneath me. Now, they are the only ones who look me in the eye. And they treat me with more dignity than I ever gave them." The guards would find the letter weeks later, tucked under a stack of legal forms, but it would never leave the prison. Back in Cambridge, Thiago walked across the small stage of a community center, this time not in a cap and gown, but in a plain button-down shirt. Before him sat a group of high school students from neighborhoods like the one he grew up in. On the wall behind him, a simple banner read, "Santos Foundation. Digital justice and opportunity for all." He told them about the night by the pool, about the way a single act of courage had led to a fight far bigger than he could have imagined. He told them how intelligence, persistence, and allies could dismantle even the strongest walls. And he told them the truth he'd learned. Your place isn't given to you, it's built by you. In the front row, San. At Isabella, now 17, her wheelchair replaced by a lighter, more advanced model. She was an activist now, speaking for disability rights at schools and conferences. When Thiago finished, she wheeled forward, took the microphone, and said simply, "He didn't just save my life, he showed me how to live it." The applause that followed was warm and genuine, not the kind that fades when the cameras leave, but the kind that grows in the quiet afterward. Outside, the rain had stopped and sunlight spilled across the street. Carmen waited for her son by the door, a proud, knowing smile on her face. As they stepped out together, the city moved around them, busy, loud, alive. The story had started with a single dive into a pool. It had ended here, with ripples that reached far beyond anything Thiago could have imagined. And somewhere, deep in his bones, he knew those ripples weren't done moving yet. Because legacies, once set in motion, don't stop. They grow,